Northward southward southeasterly 3, increasing 4 or 5,
Fisher,
occasionally
German
6
bite.
later,
West or northwest 3 or 4, increasing 5 or 6.
Fastnet, Irish Sea,
Showers.
west backing
Good.
southwest 4 or 5, occasionally 6 later in North Irish Sea.
Cork, the capital city of the Fastnet area, is a lively place. Ireland's second city and a centre of Irish industry, it's always bustling, busy and noisy, not least on my visit, when they had decided to dig up and relay most of the roads in the centre, all at the same time. It wasn't Cork City I'd come to see, however. I caught a train to Cove, a harbour town along the coast of Cork that has possibly the saddest history of any place on the shipping forecast map. For a pretty little harbour town, Cove had seen more than its fair share of heartbreaking partings in its time. Between 1848 and 1950, more than 6 million people emigrated from Ireland, nearly half of them travelling from Cove, or Queenstown, as it was known in the period between Queen Victoria's visit in 1849 and partition in 1921. The Great Famine of the 1840s was the true catalyst for emigration from Ireland. The potato crop on which Ireland depended for its subsistence failed in 1845 and 1846 and partially failed for the next 3 years. An estimated 750,000 people starved to death, while a further 1.5 million left the country out of a total population of around only 8 million. They went to Australia, America, Canada, England, anywhere in fact that wasn't Ireland. It wasn't all beer and skittles either. Passage was cheap, but that was because the conditions on board were often horrific. Accommodation and sanitation were rudimentary at best, and the vessels didn't become known as coffin ships for nothing. Cove's railway station is the original building through which the emigrants passed and were processed prior to departure from the deepwater terminal outside. The station building itself has been converted into a cafe and a museum devoted to the Queenstown story, grabbing you as you step off the train and arrive in the town, anxious to impart the tragic history of the place. Inside, it's a bright and airy building strewn with tables and chairs, trellises and pot plants. It must be a far cry from when the place was overcrowded with the anxious, fetid, crammed mass of people preparing to bid farewell to loved ones and leave behind everything they knew for the unknown. Standing among the potted shrubs and lattes, it was hard to appreciate the sheer scale of this hemorrhage of humanity that shuffled through here in its Sunday suit, best shoes and flat cap. Looking back, there were 2 clues on the ferry crossing from Liverpool that the Isle of Man would be a little different from what I'm used to. First, there was the announcement that asked, would any passenger missing a left shoe please contact a member of the crew? Then there was the response to my query as to whether they had any of the day's newspapers on board. No, I'm sorry, we haven't, came the reply. I think there might be a telegraph from last week somewhere, if that's any good. The Isle of Man lies in the Irish Sea, almost exactly at the centre point between England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland. It's also the halfway point on a line drawn between Land's End and John O'Groats, a location that has not dimmed its Manx heritage one iota. Quite the opposite, in fact. It's claimed that the advantage of the Manx 3-legged symbol is that it never kneels to England. At 31 miles long and 13 wide, Man was certainly the largest of the islands I'd be visiting on this journey. Most of the rocky outcrops I'd been exploring could be circumnavigated comfortably between breakfast and a hearty lunch. As I would discover, the Isle of Man presented a far hardier challenge. I knew little of the Isle of Man before visiting, other than that it staged the TT races every year and had been the birthplace of a girl on whom I'd had an enormous crush when I was at school. Like most island and seafaring communities, the Manx are inherently superstitious. Man is brimming with legends about the fairies that are said to inhabit the place, and even today islanders go out of their way so as not to upset the little folk. In the old days, abandoned houses would be left untouched as residences for the fairies, and derelict cottages would have food and drink left on the doorstep by obliging neighbours. At sea, Manx sailors and fishermen were not allowed to whistle, as that aggravated the wind. Fishermen were particularly superstitious about the third boat leaving port, as it was supposed to be unlucky, so much so that after the first 2 boats had left, they'd lash the next couple together, in order that there wouldn't actually be a third boat sailing out of port. Cycling the Isle of Man TT course on a push bike was probably not the greatest idea I've ever had. Barely halfway around the course, my legs felt as if the muscles were on the outside and being twanged by small children. My lungs were trying to batter their way out through my ribs, and my drumming heart was fighting its way up into the back of my throat, wanting to strangle me. Yet, only a few weeks earlier, in the warm comfort of my own home, it had seemed such a fantastic idea. The 37 3/4 mile course, used in its current format since 1911, is run entirely on public roads, allowing a perhaps unique opportunity for the hapless amateur like myself to emulate, or at least imitate, the sporting greats. How often do you get the opportunity to curl a free kick into the top corner at the San Siro, or heave an enormous six into the mound stand at Lord's? These legendary venues are out of bounds to us mortals, but the TT course, home to one of the world's greatest motorcycle races, was there to be conquered. By me. Now, motorbikes are, I confess, a mystery to me. I don't know a spark plug from a bath plug. Yet here was a rare opportunity to follow in the footsteps of some of the greatest names in sporting history. Men like Joey Dunlop, Mike Halewood and Carl Fogarty. It was nearly 40 miles, certainly, but surely no bother on a bike. After all, 2002 TT winner Dave Jeffries had lapped the course in 18 minutes dead. So it was that I found myself on a hired mountain bike on the start line of the world-famous TT course one damp, blustery morning. There was even a grandstand alongside me as I psyched myself up, but unlike on race days, it was inhabited only by a snootily aloof seagull. Within seconds of my pressing my first pedal, the wind was forcing my hair back from my forehead, and I was hurtling down Bray Hill at an impressive velocity. Feeling exhilarated and instantly high on adrenaline, I tucked in aerodynamically, like the pros. Then the traffic lights changed, and I skidded inelegantly to a shuddering halt. Curses, I thought. There goes my assault on the lap record. I'd told people in the hotel on my first night on the island what I was going to do, and they were impressed. "Doing the mountain course on a push bike, eh?" they'd said. As I puffed uphill past the 2-mile marker, the word mountain suddenly came hurtling back to me. The Isle of Man TT course goes up a mountain. Hence, within a few miles of the start, I was really struggling. I was well out of Douglas and into the countryside, and the wind was whipping across me. With classic timing, I'd chosen a day when Britain was being lashed by gales, sending roof slates flying and trees tumbling across the country. And I was halfway up a mountain, ill-equipped without even a bottle of water, alone and on a push bike. Nobody knew where I was. It was when I'd reached the monochrome limits of my endurance and the hailstones began flinging themselves out of the grey sky to sting my rosy face that I betrayed the basic ethics of sport. Out in the Manx Hills with a storm brewing and only a temperamental set of derailleur gears between me and death from exposure, my Corinthian principles deserted me completely. I phoned my friend Jo and summoned her to rescue me. Jo was not too impressed at my breathless pleas to prevent me from dying of exposure and exhaustion by coming to find me in the car, but hats off to her. She played the role of the St. Bernard dog to perfection, lacking only the little barrel of brandy around her neck for the full effect. I threw the bike in the boot and prostrated myself along the back seat of the car. In terms of cycling prowess, I may be more Homer Simpson than Tommy Simpson, but for some reason, something told me to press on. Rest up for a couple of miles, and then, as the saying goes, put me back on the bloody bike. So that's exactly what I did, and a pattern soon developed for the rest of the course. I would wobble my way up the mountainside for as many miles, or more usually yards, as my jellied legs would carry me, then recover in the car for a bit. In my defence, I could have just packed it in and still pretended I'd done it. No one would have been any the wiser, and at least I was making a token effort. But it was there on the top of Snaefell Mountain, with the island beneath obscured by mist, that I felt the true extent of my shame. I stood buffeted by the gale in front of the statue erected in memory of arguably the TT's greatest ever rider, Joey Dunlop. The Ulsterman had taken the Manx checkered flag a record 26 times before his death racing in Estonia in 2000. He'd been sculpted, leaning back on his machine with a cheery grin, but up there in the misty silence, his smile mocked me. It was mostly downhill for the final 3 or 4 miles, which I managed to complete on the bike despite being engulfed in a fierce hailstorm, and I crossed the finish line a wiser and far more humble man than when I had last been there some 7 hours earlier. Many riders had cheated death on this course. I had just cheated. I wasn't able to visit the next sea area on the list, but then until relatively recently more people had been to the moon than had been to Rockall. On the face of it, Rockall, which sits miles from any major shipping route, is a pretty insignificant thing. It took the Cold War for Rockall to acquire any great significance beyond a motel for itinerant guillemots. In the early days of the Iron Curtain, the British were using South Uist in the Hebrides as a firing range, which prompted then Defence Secretary Harold Macmillan to fear that the Russians could use Rockall as a base for spying on their Hebridean pyrotechnics. Thus, the British decided to formally claim it as their own. The whole thing was done with a quintessentially British attention to detail and ceremony. 2 soldiers and a civil servant were taken by helicopter from HMS Vidal and lowered onto Rockall with a Union flag, a plaque, a bucket of cement and a couple of trowels. The 3 men stood to attention as the flag was raised. At that, the Vidal sailed past and unleashed a 21-gun salute. By 1971, there was strong reason to suggest that Rockall was sitting on top of a great big bubbling cloud of natural gas. The Danes, Icelanders and Irish suddenly got interested. In response to this, however, the British government passed the Rockall Act of 1972, which made Rockall officially part of Inverness-shire. Events after this became increasingly farcical, especially when Britain imposed a 50-mile exclusion zone around the rock and began issuing petrol drilling rights and licences. The Danes and Icelanders reinforced their claim to the region by arguing that Rockall was uninhabitable and therefore couldn't be called an island, something that would prevent the British imposing their exclusion zone. So in 1985, the British government flew former SAS man Tom McLean out to the island and had him live there in the middle of the Atlantic in a pod for just over a month. In June 1997, Rockall hit the headlines again when 3 Greenpeace activists occupied the rock for a total of 42 days. By British criteria, this made Rockall theirs. They asserted their claim by renaming the rock Waveland and declaring it a global state committed to worldwide environmental protection. At first, the British responded with the political equivalent of sticking their fingers in their ears and chanting "La la la, can't hear you," but within weeks had decided to finally comply with the international law of the sea by giving up their claim to fishing rights of the 60,000 square miles of water around the rock. While Britain had to cede to international law in this case, it did point out that as Rockall lies within 200 miles of St Kilda, it is still a British possession. For me, though, Rockall will never truly be British until it boasts half a dozen estate agents and a residents' association complaining that the police presence isn't visible enough.
Malin Hebrides, south or southeast, backing northeast 5 to 7. Showers, then
Rockall,
rain,
southwest,
moderate
veering
weather.
west 4 or 5, increasing 6
Northwest
or 7.
Fitzroy, variable 3 or 4, mainly fair, good.